Welcome back. Over the last 7 episodes, we've taken a journey through a perspective that's become less familiar in recent decades, a systems oriented, mid 20th century approach to sociology. We've revisited thinkers like Parsons and Merton, not just for the sake of history, but to recover ideas that help us understand the world we live in now. Today, we're not introducing new concepts. Instead, we're stepping back. First, we'll walk briefly through the tools we've gathered, an inventory of what we might call our sociological toolkit, just to refresh. Then we'll turn to a narrative, not one that I'll analyze for you, but one that invites you to do the thinking and using your newfound tools. We'll follow a man named Dan as he tries to make sense of his own life, his family, his work, his town, and along the way, you'll likely recognize many of the concepts we've explored together. Think of it as a two-part session. First, a look back at what we've learned, and then a chance to put it to work. We began with basic systems thinking in episode 1. We asked, what if groups and societies work like an ecosystem? We explored how roles, norms, expectations, and frames of communication interact. We started thinking about adaptation and equilibrium, not stasis, but stability that bends without breaking. We learned to spot feedback loops and to notice when something isn't working, maybe it's because one part of the system is absorbing some strain. Instead of only asking who or what is failing, we ask, what part of the system is being strained or thrown off balance here, and why? Episode 2 turned to individual action. We explored the relationship between social structures and individual agency, how people's actions are influenced in all sorts of varied ways by social systems that were themselves built through prior individual agency. We learned about unintended consequences, explanations for them, and how patterns of thoughts and behaviors arise from social structures that have been absorbed over time, shaping not just what people do, but what feels natural or obvious to them. In episode 3, we took a closer look at culture. We broke it into parts, patterns of thoughts and behavior, and the materials of thoughts and behaviors. We explored when culture is more likely to resist change, and how mismatch between its elements can create tension. Importantly, we considered how this schema can help us understand and preserve our cherished micro-level cultures. Then, in episode 4, we focused on social institutions, enduring frameworks that organize life. Family, education, religion, economy, law. We learned that institutions are functionally necessary, but historically and culturally variable. We saw how they interlock and shift, how when one changes, the others experience pressure to adapt. Episode 5 explored how power actually works in social life, beyond titles or loud voices. We unpacked the differences between influence, authority, power, and domination, and thought about how power can operate through systems, roles, and relationships. By understanding the different forms power can take, we became better equipped to navigate pressure and spot unseen dynamics. Episode 6 examined deviance as a window into how groups and societies define, enforce, and sometimes adjust their norms. We explored how structural strain, individual responses, and institutional reactions shape what is recognized as deviant, and how deviance, while in excess can be dysfunctional, can also sometimes serve stabilizing, constructive purposes for the system. In episode 7, we explored how social order is maintained through formal rules and institutions, but also through everyday interactions, shared expectations, and informal bonds. We examined how trust, oversight, and community ties help reinforce cohesion, and how families and neighborhoods play a vital role in guiding behavior before formal systems ever need to step in. All these ideas point in one direction. Life makes more sense when we stop isolating events and start seeing systems and how social patterns are not only around us, but also within us. Now, what follows is a story, or some vignettes from one person's life, told in ordinary moments. You won't hear any names of theories or labels for concepts, but the ideas we've been discussing are woven throughout. The challenge, or the invitation, is this: listen closely and use sociological systems thinking concepts to try to answer the challenge questions yourself. I won't be revealing any perfect, expected answers at the end, but if the ideas from these last 7 episodes have taken root, you'll find yourself making sense of what's happening, perhaps imagining what could be done next. Scene 1. Dan had been a fixture at his local church for over 30 years. He wasn't on the board or in any official leadership position anymore, but people still gravitated toward him. New members often said Dan was the first person who made them feel welcomed. The kids who used to be in his Sunday school class, now young adults, still waved to him across the sanctuary. Even the associate pastor sometimes checked in with Dan to get a sense of how people were feeling about things. Dan had a knack for connecting people, and folks knew that if you wanted something done, organizing a meal train, finding a good roofer, getting someone to sing at the Easter service, Dan could make it happen. He always seemed to know who had what skills and who needed a little encouragement to step up. When he gave someone a quiet thumbs up or passed along praise to the right person, it carried weight. But lately, Dan felt uneasy. The church board was discussing repurposing part of the fellowship hall, a space his small group used regularly. Dan wasn't asked for input, and word was that the decision had already been made. One of the board members, a newer guy with a strong personality, had been pushing hard for a different vision of how the space should be used. Dan was frustrated. They've made up their minds, he told his wife. No one wants to hear from folks like me anymore. It's not my church, I guess. He pulled back, skipping a planning meeting for the next potluck and brushing off a request to help organize the fall picnic. Here's a challenge question. Dan doesn't see himself as having any influence in this situation. But what forms of power does he actually have? And how might he use those forms of influence to make a difference in this church community, even without a formal title? What are some steps Dan could take to re-engage and help steer the outcome in a constructive way? Scene 2. It was supposed to be a calm summer evening. Burgers on the grill, lawn chairs in a circle, and kids darting around with sparklers while the grown-ups exchanged stories. The extended family hadn't been together like this in a while, and Dan was proud to host. But as the evening wore on, one of the younger adults, maybe 19 or 20 years old, started getting loud, really loud. It was obvious he'd had a few drinks. He made a couple of off-color jokes. Then he got into a weird argument with his mom about politics. At one point, he nearly knocked over the card table. No one seemed to think too much of it, though. At least, no one said anything. Dan was mortified. He spent most of the night trying not to think about it, but it ate at him. What's happening to our family? He asked his wife as they cleaned up. This isn't who we are. Here's a challenge question. From a systems sociological perspective, what could Dan do next? Could this moment of deviance somehow actually end up strengthening the family's sense of shared values? How might he respond in a way that promotes unity rather than division? Scene 3. Dan's wife, Linda, works as an assistant principal at the local middle school. It's a small school in a town where people still tend to know each other. Lately, though, she's been noticing that despite having clearly posted rules, misbehavior seems to be rising. The rules are being broken, not always in dramatic ways, but enough to cause disruptions. swearing in the halls, skipping minor assignments, and a lot of hallway roaming. Linda and her team have tried addressing it with formal policies, reminders in assemblies, notes home, even detentions. But none of it seems to be making much of a difference. She vents to Dan one evening, it's like the rules aren't even real anymore. No one seems to take them seriously, and I can't suspend every kid over every hallway violation. She described her frustrations, and Dan listened, unsure of what to say. He started wondering aloud whether something deeper might be going on, whether the students even felt connected to their teachers or the school. Here's your challenge question. If Dan were to talk through this with Linda, what might he suggest as ways to strengthen social order in the school? How might they consider informal sources of control and influence beyond the posted rules? Scene 4. Over the past few years, subtle changes had swept through Dan's town. A new distribution center opened on the outskirts, drawing in workers with decent wages, but requiring rotating shifts and unpredictable hours. The local church had recently scaled back its community programming after its longtime pastor retired. The high school had dropped its mandatory volunteer hours. A once popular grocery store where neighbors used to catch up and post flyers had shut down, replaced by a chain that didn't allow public notices. This spring, Dan found himself scrambling to organize the town's annual festival. For years, it had run on goodwill and neighborly spirit, but now volunteers canceled last minute. The high schoolers didn't come at all. The retired couple who usually ran the food tent said they were just too tired this year. Dan was exasperated. People just don't care like they used to, he told his wife. No one follows through anymore. Here's a challenge question for you. How might Dan see this situation differently if he approached it through a systems thinking lens? What might he be missing by assuming that the main problem is people's lack of interest? Scene 5. Every October, Dan's small town held the Fall Barn Social. It was part harvest celebration, part community potluck, and part old-time variety show. People would gather in the big, refurbished barn on the edge of town, bales of hay around the edges, strings of warm lights overhead. Kids ran around in flannel and boots, older couples danced to live music, and nearly every table had something homemade, apple pie or venison chili. What made it special wasn't just the food or decorations. It was how everyone seemed to know what to do. You helped set up if you arrived early. You clapped for the shy kid playing harmonica. You cleaned up even if you didn't bring anything. Teenagers took turns holding babies so their parents could dance. And even though no one really said it out loud, there was a kind of code, an understanding about respect, warmth, and generosity. Dan found himself standing outside after one of these evenings, watching the smaller kids chase fireflies near the parking lot. He felt a lump in his throat. I really hope this is still here when they're grown, he said to his wife. I just don't want this kind of thing to disappear. Here's a challenge question. If Dan wanted to help preserve this tradition and pass it along, what are some things he could do? How could understanding the 4 elements of culture help him keep it alive? Scene 6. In recent years, the local community college quietly phased out its trade certification programs, citing funding shifts and lower enrollment. At the same time, local high schools increased their focus on 4-year college prep, with posters in the hallways boasting university acceptance rates and counselors emphasizing scholarship deadlines over job readiness. Meanwhile, a steady stream of TikToks and YouTube videos celebrated remote tech jobs and escaping the 9-to-5 grind, often portraying work in the trades as something to avoid if you can. Dan, who helps oversee hiring at a mid-sized manufacturing plant, has been scratching his head. A decade ago, the company had more applicants than openings. Now, positions stay posted for months with few serious bites. The HR team tried raising the starting pay and even hosted a local job fair, but turnout was disappointing. Dan told a colleague, "It's like young people just don't want to work anymore. They've got the wrong mindset." Here's a challenge question for you. If Dan were thinking like a sociologist, what larger dynamics might he notice here? How might changes in other institutions be shaping the labor pool in ways that go beyond individual motivation? Scene 7. At the mid-sized manufacturing company where Dan works, they'd recently introduced a new policy. Concerned that too much time was being lost to idle chatter during shift changes, he required that employees clock in and be at their stations before the top of the hour. No more lingering in the break room or hallway small talk. He framed it as a productivity measure. Tighten things up a little, boost efficiency. It seemed simple enough. But within a few weeks, Dan noticed something odd. Morale seemed lower. Workers who used to cover for one another, grabbing extra parts, helping a newcomer adjust, were now keeping their heads down. Turnover among the newest hires ticked up. Someone even left an anonymous note in the suggestion box that read, "This place feels cold." Worse, by a few months later, production had actually dipped. With more employees leaving, training costs had gone up. The shift supervisor had to spend even more time onboarding. Dan, frustrated, insisted his rule had been common sense and couldn't understand why things weren't improving. Here's a challenge question for you. What might Dan be missing? How could a systems thinking lens on unintended consequences help explain what's happened here? What changes could Dan make to repair morale and productivity while still meeting his original goals? Well, that's it for this series. Thanks for joining me for this journey through mid-century sociology. Whether you've been with us from episode 1 or just dropped in for this session, I hope you found something here that's useful. If any of the ideas we've explored sparked something in you, I encourage you to keep going. Go back and revisit Parsons, Merton, Durkheim, Weber. Dig into the theories we only had time to sketch. And remember, sociology isn't just a subject to study. In its classic form, it's a way of asking better questions and seeing how the pieces of our social world fit together. In its classic form, sociology offers a slower, deeper kind of insight, one that looks for patterns and helps us figure out how to keep things working well. Thanks again for tuning in.